Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on the fourth of 4 webinars discussing the National Survey of Attitudes of Wind Power Project Neighbors. This is Ben Hohen talking from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I am joined today by 2 colleagues that we've had the pleasure of working with, Gundula Hubner and Johannes Pohl from Germany. They're going to be picking up the webinar about halfway through, or no, in about 10 minutes or so, and you'll hear their voices then. So I have a few little pieces of housekeeping to start with. First, as you probably already know, you are muted, but we want to hear from you, and so please submit questions at any time via the chat window, and we'll be monitoring them during the webinar, and then we'll have time for them at the end of the webinar to answer. If they're technical questions, we'll try to get them answered during the webinar. Let's see, I guess that's it for the housekeeping. So why don't we get going here. The one thing you should know is that this is being recorded. I think you might have heard that, and that this webinar recording will be available on the project page, and we'll have links for that, and we can also share them via the chat window during the webinar. So you can find them there. You'll also be able to get these slides. So if you're anxious to see a slide again, you'll be able to do that too. So with that, why don't we step into the webinar. So this is just a quick background about Gundula and Johannes. I wanted to touch on this so they didn't have to. We've just had a lot of a great pleasure working with them. They bring in a perspective that is unique, both in terms of their expertise, which focuses on social psychology and looking at stress impacts of wind turbines and the biopsychology of energy systems. But they also bring in the international perspective to be able to talk about research and think about research that they've either conducted or been are aware of that has been conducted in Europe. And this, of course, allows us to think more broadly about the research conducted here. And that will be one of the subjects that's covered in the webinar today, comparing our results from the national survey to those that Gundula and Johannes have been part of that were conducted in Europe. So this will be the agenda today. I'm going to give you a background on the survey. Those of you that have been part of these webinars will probably be able to tune out during this first part 1 and part 2 because it's the same slides as before, but if you're new, it is important background to be able to know where we started from. So I'll cover part 1 and part 2, and then I'm going to hand it over to Gundula, and Johannes, I believe, is seated beside her, and she'll cover part 3, and then I'll circle back for the last bit and open it up for Q&A. So now we're stepping even further back. This is the whole overview of the whole project, and this has been a project that's been a collaboration of a variety of different individuals with a variety of different expertises from different institutions bringing in their own perspective. And if you've been part of this webinar series, you've heard from them as we've gone along, at least many of them. And I've just really enjoyed being able to work with these fantastic experts in various areas, and hopefully have allowed us to expand the scope of the work much more broadly than we would have had it just been the folks from LBNL. So, and you'll hear some of that today. So the last thing to note is that this work has been funded by the Department of Energy, the Wind Energy Technologies Office, and of course we thank them for their support of this work. So why study public acceptance at all? Well, as you can see from the figure on the left, at least as of 2015, there were approximately a little less than 1.4 million homes within 5 miles of industrial scale wind facilities in the United States. And of course, those numbers have been growing as we've gone into 2016 and 2017 and now into 2018. Coupled with that, we've seen that the proximity to those homes has been slowly shrinking. Not dramatically so, but it surely hasn't been going away. And this means that the communities that are surrounding the wind facilities in the United States are inextricably tied to those facilities. They obviously have had the ability to see them. They might be able to hear them. And for communities that are considering wind energy, they have the ability often to be the final vote to allow a project to go forward or not. So the community members are extremely important, and so this is one of the bases for this study, to better understand those communities. The goal of the work more broadly is to provide a broad-based representative sample of individuals living near these wind facilities in the United States. It was the first time a broad-based study had been done in the United States. The hope of that is to provide the stakeholders a better understanding of kind of the attitudes, both the positive and negative attitudes around these facilities, to better understand how to develop projects in the future. For instance, provide greater confidence to those individuals that are considering wind energy in their community as to what are the likely effects, both positive and negative. And then we hope the work will inform wind stakeholder and DOE R&D priorities in the future as we look to develop more and more responsible projects as we go forward in the changing energy system, as well as we see turbines changing dramatically too over time. So the project followed a very simple timeline here, from literature review out to outreach, which is where we are now. And I have one quick slide here on the literature review before stepping into the survey instrument. I just want to point out this great work that was led by Joe Rand. It summarized the literature going back to 1987, focused on North America, but it also includes the literature in public acceptance and wind energy in Europe as well, at least parts of it. And this allows one to very quickly dive into the literature and find particular areas of interest that might be interesting to you. So I recommend you take a look at this paper. It is available on our website on the project page. So let me talk a little bit about the survey frame, and then I'll hand it over to Gundula and Johannes. So the data collection occurred at the end of 2015 through 2016 using phone, internet, and mail survey modes, so it was a multimodal. It was a 22-minute survey, so quite long, with over 50 questions. And even though we've had 4 webinars, or we will have by the end of today, we still haven't covered everything that is available to cover in this data collection effort. It's a massive data collection effort, but it gives us a lot to look at, and hopefully we'll continue to do so in the future. We collected responses from 1,705 individuals, and we're very happy with this given the fact that this was an election year, and so we were competing with all the other individuals that were phoning these folks and reaching out to them. Those 1,705 individuals were arrayed around 250 wind projects across 24 states. And the projects that we selected needed to have turbines that were greater than or equal to 364 feet tall and greater than or equal to 1.5 megawatts in capacity. And we needed those individuals to be within 5 miles. And this gave us a sample frame that was more closely aligned with a modern turbine, leaving much smaller turbines of lower capacities aside. We did want to make sure we oversampled very close to the turbines where there weren't many individuals, and so we did that. And we also, for similar reasons, oversampled near large projects because those are generally erected in rural areas where there aren't large numbers of population. If we didn't do that oversampling, you end up getting sample, for instance, around a single turbine in a high population density area. And as was the subject of the third webinar, we oversampled near where we modeled sound also, and we'll be talking briefly about some of that modeling sound today. Those are shown on the map in the red stars. So if we look at the distribution of responses based on distance, you can see from the slide now that the majority of the respondents are very close to the turbines, within a half mile, or 0.8 kilometers. And that's actually opposite the way the actual population is arrayed. So to deal with that, we had to weight the sample back to the underlying population. And this is very commonly done when you want to adjust the research results to the underlying sample. And we did this not only to correct for our sampling frame and the choices that we used in terms of oversampling, but also to adjust the results to the underlying population, because our survey respondents were slightly different in some cases than the underlying population. and so we weighted them to correct for that. So this sample that you'll be talking about, you'll be seeing today, is representative of the population. And let's see. Next slide is just discussing the various areas of research that we have conducted already under this. And most of you that have been part of the webinar series have heard about these various areas. If you're not already familiar with them, I do encourage you to go to the website on the project page and look at these individual areas where we'll have recorded webinars and PowerPoints available. And in some cases, we have journal papers. So this gets us to the final topic-specific analysis area that Gundula and Johannes will cover. So one last slide before I leave you is to tell you that these results are preliminary. They have been not yet submitted for peer review, and so they could change as that work progresses, and those changes could result in changes to our conclusions that we draw today. Now, we don't expect dramatic changes to occur. We've been over these results many, many times, but it is possible. So just note that if you do want to cite this work, and I'm giving you a citation here, this will be in the slide deck and will also be in the final slide, so that you can be clear that these are preliminary results. So I think that's it. With that, I'll hand it over to Gundula. Are you there, Gundula?
Hello. Can you hear me?
All right. You take it away, and I will be monitoring the chat log and come back in after your part of the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Hello everybody from Germany, and thank you very much, Ben, for the very nice introduction. So we come to the part now as psychologists about comparing strongly annoyed individuals with symptoms near turbines, and we also have the chance to compare it to European communities. And I will explain you why this is very special. So our purpose is to really find out what makes a difference between strongly annoyed persons and people who are not strongly annoyed. And as we have the chance to compare it to research that Johannes and me have done before, we can see how reliable these data are. So if the US would be just one single case, although it is a fantastic sampling study, a really great survey, it could still be something very special for the US. But if we have the chance to compare it with Europe, and we would find the same result patterns, it would be even stronger results. Well, and I can tell you, we did find comparable results. So just to give you some understandings about the methods, I make it very brief here. So we are working very quantitative, and now we compare the people who live inside the 3-mile zone to the nearest wind turbine. And we will show you means mainly, also frequencies, and we also will try to analyze differences between groups by t-tests, and we also analyze the frequencies, whether they are significant differences or not, by chi-square tests, and we also use correlations. And you might find a correlation that is significant, but following Cohen, significance of a correlation does not necessarily have to have a strong meaning. So that's why we give you this little information here, Cohen's test, and he gives us an orientation whether a correlation or another test is of relevance or not. It might be significant but not relevant. I will come back to this later when I show you the results. Okay, so I haven't learned to get this green arrow back. Need some help here. I just leave the green arrow. Okay, go to the next slide. So just to let you have an overview about the samples that we could use for the comparison, you see here two samples from Germany and one from Switzerland. So we summed this up as Europe, and maybe just this slide is just, this raw is interesting for you. We have more than 1,000 people that we can use for the comparison, and all these numbers you see here are just telling you that it is comparable to the US. So I think that is an important information for you. And then here we have the demographic variables, and again between the USA and Europe, our Europe sample, we have very small effect sizes. That's what I told you before, referring to Cohen. We have a small difference between it, but it is not relevant. It's too small, and here we even don't have any significant difference. That is, we have comparable samples. And the same goes for the present attitudes toward the wind farm. Again, this is rather comparable, although the number in Europe is a little more positive compared to the US. But it's not something important here. You see it's just a small difference, small importance. So this gives you an overview about the sample from Europe, and you can see that it is comparable to the US sample. So, and again, here we see that the US residents perceive the planning process as more fair, but are more annoyed by it compared to Europe. You see the higher number here compared to Europe. Again, it's a small effect. The same goes for this, and being annoyed by the planning process. It's not a large difference, but it might be interesting when we come back later to understand the factors influencing acceptance and annoyance. Now, first we have to understand who can experience the blades cast shadow outside the home or inside, or who can hear a wind farm. And you see the numbers are smaller in the US compared to Europe. And maybe that's because in Europe we have a higher the people are living closer to the turbines because we have more people living here on in a smaller area compared to the US. So that might be one explanation for this difference. But most important is that the people who experience shadow cast on their homes or inside or outside, or who can hear the turbines, that's quite a rather small number, a small percentage of the people who live within this 3-mile zone. Now comes the interesting question, that is how annoyed the people are. And first have a look on the US side, and what you can see here, not at all means they are not at all annoyed, and somewhat annoyed, but it could go on to very annoyed up to 4. So in here you can see the mean of the sample, and what you can see is the means are maximum in between slightly and somewhat annoyed. So here you can see that we don't find an extreme annoyance, neither in the US nor in Europe. And the highest means you find in the US for shadow flicker and for the wind turbine sound, but we also ask in comparison for motor vehicle traffics or agricultural machinery. And what you can see here is that in comparison, the wind turbine sound and the motor vehicle traffic sound are close together. So what you can see is that wind turbine sound is not a strong annoyance, and also not the other features of the turbines. In comparison to Germany, you find a little higher annoyance by the shadow flickering, and also in the other categories. But still, in the US and in Europe, you can see that the overall annoyance on average is it's around slightly or somewhat. So this is important to know, because the opponents like to stress out that people are really annoyed. Everybody's annoyed. It's very dramatic. It's very strongly. But if you have these numbers, you can see that seems not to be the case. Now, when we ask the people, we also ask them very openly, do you experience any negative effects from the wind turbines? We ask them very openly, and they can give answers to all these categories you can see here. And still, even if we ask them very openly, you see that the number of people who say they experience any negative effect is very small. So I think that's also very important. And so we question them how they cope with it. So what do they do? And the strategies they use is to talk with others, or they try to relax, etc. So this, for psychologists, is also an indicator that they take actions to cope with the problems they do have. And yeah, maybe we can say more about that later on. Now, what kind of symptoms do the people have who experience negative effects? And that's also very important to ask to better understand how the wind turbines might affect their experiences, their life. And what we can see is that here, if you have a look into being in a bad mood, you can see that the people who experience negative effects are experience being in a bad mood by sound by 3.3%, so that's also a very small number. Landscape change and lightning, shadow flickering are lower. And I just like to add this landscape change number is something special we find in the US. We don't see this in Europe. So it does not have any symptoms in the people that the landscape changes. But here we see in the US being in a bad mood due to the landscape change. We have very small percentages concerning anger due to the sound of the turbines, etc. And so we have here a lack of concentration for the sound. So 2.4% report that they have a lack of concentration due to wind turbine sound, and also difficulties falling asleep and otherwise not sleeping well, that is waking up, for example. So these are the highest numbers you can see of symptoms that are reported from these people who experience negative effects. So you see overall it's rather small numbers, and I think that's also very important to know. Now, before we said that we assessed annoyance, that is not at all annoyance, annoyed is 0 up to 4, very strongly annoyed. And then next I showed you that we asked the people whether they experience symptoms or not, negative effects of the turbines or not. So in our approach is that we say just asking whether you are annoyed or not is not enough, because this is closely connected to having an attitude towards the wind turbines. As psychologists, we say that if somebody is annoyed, this person should also experience symptoms to be really strongly annoyed. So we make a distinction between just saying I'm annoyed, I'm strongly annoyed, and having symptoms. And this brings us to our definition of annoyance stress scale that I would like to explain to you now. So what we do here is, as I said before, we make a combination of the annoyance level, not at all too strong, and we also add the symptom frequency. So people who have not experienced sound or flicker, they are not in this scale. But the people who experience sound or flicker and, who experience this, but they hear this, but they don't have any turbines, so they say they are not at all annoyed, fall into the category not at all annoyed. The people who are slightly annoyed, who can hear or experience and are slightly annoyed but don't have any symptoms, also now fall into the category of slightly within our annoyance stress scale. And the people who say, just asking about their annoyance level, I'm somewhat, moderately, or very annoyed, but don't have symptoms, they fall into the category of somewhat annoyed in our annoyance stress scale. So that's what I explained just before. And now we have this group, people who are at least moderately annoyed or very annoyed and experience any of the symptoms mentioned before, monthly, weekly, or daily, are grouped into strongly. So please note that here we are very conservative. So we would include a person in here who says, yes, once a month I awake because I hear the wind turbine. So we would count this as a stress symptom, and we would put this person into a category of strongly annoyed in our annoyance stress scale. So I hope I could explain to you understandable, because now we're going to use this annoyance stress scale to explain the further results, and we use this for the further analysis. So if we have now a look into the annoyance stress scale, remember, so here we also include whether a person experiences symptoms or not. then you can see that the stress-related annoyance is very rare. So we can see, and we look here to the US only, that the a very small portion of persons are falling into the category of strongly annoyed, that is, at least moderately annoyed and experiencing symptoms, in this case due to wind turbine sound. So we here foresee just 1%, landscape 2%, light 1%, and the shadow 2%. So these are rather small numbers, and I think this is also a very important finding, so that the people living close up to 3 miles close to a wind turbine have experienced just a very low number experiences really strong annoyance, that is, including stress symptoms. So when we draw, what we have to understand, that's what we also do when we try to understand other problems of health or social problems, etc. You always have to have a look into the whole population. And that's what we did here. As you can see here, we have the total number of people living up to 3 miles around the wind turbines. And you can see now, if you have this whole sample, that only a very small proportion, as I pointed out, are experiencing stress, that are strongly annoyed persons. So in total, over our total sample, it's only 2.3%. In comparison to Europe, the numbers are smaller. In Europe, we have a higher amount of people who are stressed by the wind turbine sound, that is, are strongly annoyed, although the difference is small, but it's a little higher here. Here, the landscape change doesn't make a difference. The same goes for lightning, shadow flickering, and the total number, the difference is also not relevant. So what we find, the only difference, slight difference here in the numbers, is between the sound between the US and Europe. So again, also in Europe, where we have a higher density of population, we find only few persons who are experiencing symptoms due to wind turbine sound. So now we would like to have a closer look to the people who are annoyed, who are on the sound annoyance stress scale. And so that's what I will present to you now in the next minutes. And now we're just looking onto the US and not to the comparison between US and Europe. Now, so we want to understand how sound annoyance stress, oh yes, I'm sorry, I have to add that we focus also on the sound now, because as I pointed out before, the sound has the highest number of frequencies of people who are annoyed. So we considered to concentrate on sound. So what we can see is that the people who are annoyed by the wind turbine sound are also having a negative present attitude towards the local wind turbines. You can see this here. This is the mean. Very negative to very positive is the attitude. And here you can see the stress annoyance scale. So what we can see is that the people who are strongly annoyed have a negative attitude. The people who are only slightly not at all or can't hear it are having a more positive attitude. And this is a large effect. So we can see here that really the experiencing sound annoyance is strongly correlated with the present attitude. We also wanted to understand whether it could be the experiencing of stress due to the wind turbines could be connected to chronic health problem. And what we can see here, no, it's negligibly correlated with the annoyance to this stress, to our sound annoyance stress scale. And so you could not say it's only the people who are having health problems who are annoyed by this wind turbine sound. We don't find any indicators pointing into this direction. The same goes for noise sensitivity, so that's also negligibly correlated with our sound annoyance stress scale. You see here all the means are rather comparable, and we have also small correlation. And following the definition of the impact of this correlation, it is really negligibly. So you couldn't say it's only the people who are noise sensitive. Then we also see a strong correlation between sound annoyance and the perceived planning process fairness. And it's a very interesting finding. You can see here that this is really a strong correlation. That is, the people who experienced the planning process less fair experience stronger annoyance later when the turbines are in action, so when they are operating. And I think this also already gives us some hints what could be done to reduce negative effects and also to improve acceptance of wind turbines, and that is having an eye on the planning process fairness. Next step, again, the sound annoyance is also strongly correlated with the planning process annoyance, and that's the same result pattern as I addressed before. That is, people who were not at all annoyed by the planning process are also less annoyed by the operating wind turbines. And here you can see the people who are strongly annoyed, this 1.8% here, they also experienced the planning process as more annoying, as you can see here in this relation. And again, we have a very high correlation here. Now this is a question that we are asked very often. People ask again and again, isn't there a connection between the distance to the next turbine and the sound annoyance people experience? And we can clearly say no, it's not. And we find the same finding in Europe over the different samples that we have here and that we could compare. So what you can see here, this is the distance from the nearest wind turbine, and it ends at 3 miles because we're in this 3-mile zone. And what you can see here that the people who are strongly annoyed are living in a comparable distance as the people who are slightly annoyed, for example. So you don't see a difference here in the distance within this or between this annoyance categories, groups, as you can say here. So that's a clear indicator. And you also can see that we have a negligible correlation between the sound annoyance stress scale and the distance to the nearest turbine. And we can have, this is a slide with many numbers, but I help to have a close or a fast look through here. So here we have included the people who cannot hear the wind turbines, just to show for the whole population how the results look. And what you can see here is that the people who are strongly annoyed are closer to half a mile are 7%, and up to 1 to 3 miles it's 1%, but it's not as a large difference. And the same goes here. You see for the people who are somewhat annoyed, this is a larger number, but we are mostly interested in the people who have symptoms. And if you exclude those who cannot hear, so we just have now the sample of the people who can hear the wind turbines and they live within this 3-mile zone. And here you can see that the people who live close up to half a mile to the wind turbines, 10% of them are strongly annoyed, that is, experiences symptoms, but 14% are who live farther away, up to 3 miles. So you can see here that there is no clear relation. So this shows also again very clearly that we don't find a linear a relationship between distance and annoyance. So this is even another proof that the distance is not connected to this experiencing of stress. And now this is a little more complicated, but we also find that the number of turbines visible from the property. So this is a subjective number, right? So we ask the people, how many turbines can you see? And they answer what they perceive. And what we see here is that the correlation between the number of the visible number of turbines from the property and the sound annoyance is not correlated. It doesn't have a meaning. It's a very small correlation, and it doesn't have a meaning. It's negligible. But if you look at the means, you see that the people who are strongly annoyed see more wind turbines. At least that's what they say. That's what they experience. So we don't find a significant correlation, or let's say a meaningful correlation, but we see that they tend to see more wind turbines in their subjective perception. Now, if we see the number of turbines objectively that are included in the wind farm, so with just the real number, then we can see that the number of turbines nearest to in the nearest project is a little higher for the people who are strongly annoyed in comparison to the slightly and not at all annoyed, but not to the somewhat annoyed. And so you see here that these two groups are living in distance to a little larger wind farm, but they don't make a distinction between these two. Again, this shows that the experiencing symptoms is not connected to the distance directly. Now, here we try to do something else. That is, we try to understand the annoyance by calculating a regression. And so we try to find out how we can explain the variation in the answers, that is, the variations in the categories of the people who are strongly or not at all annoyed in our category, in our sound annoyance stress scale, which you are familiar by now. And what we find here again is that we just have two large significant predictors of the annoyance, sound annoyance, and that is, as we saw before in the results I presented to you, the present attitude towards wind farm. And here this also explains or has a stronger impact on annoyance as well as the planning process, that is being annoyed by the planning process. So these two variables are the strongest indicators or the strongest predictors of annoyance by wind turbines. And we also see a small effect of sensitivity to noise, but that's so very small that it seems not to be relevant. And the same goes to the total number of turbines in the nearest project, that is the objective number. But you see that the weights are very small. So what we can see here is that, as we saw before when I described the data of the mean differences and also the correlations, that the stress annoyance goes closer together with the present attitude towards the wind farm and annoyance by the planning process. Now I come to the conclusion. So I hope I could show you that the annoyance overall is rather low, and that only a few residents are strongly annoyed due to any of the emissions of the wind turbines that we addressed. And again, what we see is that the people who are stronger annoyed also having a stronger negative attitude now, again, towards the wind farm. And as said before, they had a stronger experience, a stronger annoyance by a planning process, and also they thought the planning process was less fair compared to the other groups. Now, if I just come back here to the negative attitude, this is a problem of the hen and the egg. So we are talking about correlations here or regressions. So we couldn't say because they have a negative attitude, they are more strongly annoyed. Because if we wanted to say so, we would have to make a assessment before a wind turbine was built and then what happened afterwards. Now we just can say at the moment, or when we made our survey, they had a more negative attitude. Maybe it was due to the wind turbine noise and because they felt annoyed by it, so the attitude became less positive. But we think it's also connected to the experience during the planning process, because this is a very clear indicator, the planning process annoyance, that we also found in Europe. So that this really seems to have a strong impact on the fact whether people experience stress by the wind turbine sound when the wind farm is operating. Okay, so again, the wind turbine sound annoyance, shadow flicker annoyance are slightly or moderately only, and we have also this comparable results in Europe. Why the U.S. Residents are somewhat positive, but less positive in Europe, we couldn't explain, so that might be rather interesting to hear what you suggest why this would be. Maybe in Europe the wind turbines are more well known. We have a higher density, population density, so people are more confronted with it, maybe. And we have a longer tradition of wind turbines and we had a very strong anti-nuclear power movement. Maybe that's connected. But this is open for speculation. And by the way, we also have a very strong opponents movements in some parts. Then here in Europe. Then the attitude and annoyance by the planning process indeed explains 61% in the variation of the wind turbine sound. So that's the regression that I just showed to you. And this is a very high number, 61% of explained variation, and just to these two variables. And again, this stresses the finding that the planning process and the attitudes are very important to understand annoyance due to wind turbine sound and also other emissions. And I think this is important to know, as this is very often discussed in the public and also in the media, that distance is not connected to annoyance. And also, I didn't address this, but that's what we also can tell you, that we also analyze demographic characteristics, but they don't explain sound annoyance stress. That's why we did not report them in this short presentation. Yes, and as said before, the comparable overall results patterns just prove that the U.S. case or the U.S. study is not a single case, but we can find comparable results in Europe, which makes our results in the U.S. and our joint projects even more reliable. The takeaway message, that is, as I said before, that any effects to improve the process, the planning process, might have to reduce annoyance and the related symptoms. And what could be done is the early and informal participation of residents, and also to consider their concerns. Although everybody who is dealing with planning processes knows that it is not easy to really have informal participation, where you could also really discuss where to put up a wind farm, where you could really install it, because of all the processes that go on before that people are making contracts, the landowners are making contracts with different operators, for example. But that's also something to discuss, what could be done to have a real open informal participation process that is including questioning where to place the wind turbines. Then this is the explanation why we don't find a correlation between distance and sound annoyance, and also not with shadow flicker and annoyance. That is, when the regulations are applied correctly, then we should have less stress. So it is very important to have these regulations, and by the data we found, we can see that they seem to work, because if they would not work, we would have much higher numbers of people who are annoyed strongly, that is, including symptoms. And so it should be important to even reduce the emissions as far as possible and really be very strict with these regulations concerning the emissions. So we couldn't answer all questions. To better understand annoyance, it would be very helpful to have a long monitoring process of residents to better understand how the few but all existing people are influenced by the sound parameters, for example. And Johannes and me and colleagues together here in Europe, we did research where we analyzed the sound quality and found, for example, that amplitude modulation is has an impact on stress annoyance, and it would be interesting to work here for the engineers to find solution, for example, and to better understand stress indicators and to have comparable stress indicators so that we can make you could say a stress monitor or annoyance monitor over years and over different projects. And then we could also better understand the situational conditions, and this might also improve the processes and the mitigation processes. And I think this was my last slide. Now the next step and the outreach.
Yep, that's for me, Gundula. Thank you so much.
Good.
So great job presenting in English. I know it's not your first language, so it was very easy to understand you. So I appreciate you. I just wanted to tell you you've done a great job in presenting in English. So just a few comments here, and then we'll turn to questions. Do submit your questions via the chat window. We've got a bunch of them that have come in, but we'd love to try to answer more for those of you that are on the webinar. So there is some upcoming outreach. Some of this is taking place in Europe, which is great to try to start linking the two efforts. There's lots to learn from the cases in Europe, how some of these issues that we're focused on today are being addressed, and how we might learn from each other to address this important group of individuals that are impacted by the wind turbine sounds and having symptoms. We will also be participating in a conference here in the United States. We have a Citing and Compliance Conference this month, I guess next week. So if anyone is planning on heading to Memphis, you can see us there. This work, as I mentioned at the beginning, has not been submitted to a peer review journal, but will. And so we will be going through that step. And then one thing we're very glad about is to be able to release these data to other researchers, because as I mentioned at the top, there's lots of analysis that can be done with this great body of data that has been collected, and we are really just scratching the surface. And so we hope other researchers will pick up the baton and conduct additional research using these data, maybe coupled with other data or just these data alone. Okay, so that gets us to the final slide. Here are the contact information for Gundula and Johannes and myself. Please feel free to reach out to us directly if you have questions. There is a web page that you're seeing the screenshot from on the right, which houses this information. I think at this point you can now just Google Wind Neighbor Survey or Berkeley Wind Survey, things like that, and you'll get a link to this page. And here you'll find the PowerPoints from the various presentations, and including the one today. There's a citation here if you do want to cite this work, and we would be perfectly fine with you doing that. Just make sure that you cite it as preliminary results, and it's taken from this webinar. And then finally, just thanking again the DOE for support of this important work. So, Gundula, I'm going to just feed you some questions now that have been coming in. Well, you answered one. Maybe I'll just this question came in a multiple questioners, which is just talking about the causality, the fact that there were strong correlations, could you say, for instance, that the planning process fairness attitudes came after being annoyed? Similarly, were the attitudes toward the local wind project, did they come after finding that they could hear the turbines and found that they had symptoms? Is there any way for us to know which direction these things go, or can we just at best say that they're just correlated? Gundel, are you on mute?
Yeah, we're here. I'm just talking with, we're discussing with Johannes what to answer. And I think in our US study, we could not control for that. So, but we asked in one of our German studies, we asked the people, have you been in favor or against the project when it started? So when it started to be discussed, etc. And so that's what we see. And then here the opponents were also more strongly against the wind turbine project. So that's what we can see. But yes, as I said, we can't really see. We can't really rely on causality here, because to do so we would have a pre-post design. That is, we would have really to ask all people, then we would have to install the wind farm and then ask them again. So we couldn't do this, but it would be great to do. But just from the indicators we have and from the research we have done also before and also together with others, we can see that there seems to be this connection.
Right, and I guess I can point out, as if for those of you that participated in the second webinar that was led by Jeremy Firestone, we do have data on whether individuals took action. And so I think that's what you're referring to, and actually one of the questioners was noting too, that maybe it would be better to sort of control for not attitude toward the process, but whether they actually took action. The unfortunate part of that is that your sample size gets very small quickly, because not a lot of people are strongly annoyed and not a lot of people took action. So comparing the two is difficult, but that is something that maybe would be useful to do when we start writing up a paper here. So there was another question about, which I'm sure you've heard before, so I'm kind of curious how you'll answer this, about infrasound. Is the problem about sound that cannot be heard, and therefore does it not is it not related to noise sensitivity, for instance, which is one of the parameters you looked at? Does that help explain that?
Okay, so well, I have to refer to our Europe data to answer this question, and here we have openly asked for symptoms in our Europe surveys, and you know, I told you before that we have asked more than 1,000 residents living close to wind turbines, and for stress indicators, or indicators that represent stress caused by infrasound, you can find a certain pattern, or you could if there was one. So dizziness, for example, is one indicator maybe from infrasound. We know this from studies in other fields. But so we have only, I think I have to look at Johannes, I think just in 1 or 2 cases out of more than 1,000, we had participants reporting that they felt a kind of dizziness. And, well, this is so rare, and it could be due to other things that we are quite sure that we don't find indicators for infrasound in whatever we've done up to now. And yes, I think, there's so many things to say, and I have so many anecdotes to tell about this. So I just give you one example. So we made one survey in Switzerland, and there by coincidence we got an email that one of the opponents was sending around, and he was pushing the residents to say, come on, make the answers very strong, because otherwise they won't find anything in their data. So, but the residents still answered correctly because we find only very few people who would answer really strongly, and none of these people answered into any direction that would give us the idea that there is some infrasound going on. But you're right that we could have more knowledge about it, and actually that's what we're doing at the moment in Germany. And please forgive me that I use the time now to tell you about this project. So hopefully we have results in 1.5 years. We're doing a research here in Germany where we are measuring sound in the air, in the ground, vibrations, etc. And then we also measure at the same time how the people experience it inside, outside the house, whatever is coming to their houses. So far we know that there's not much vibrations or low frequency noise or whatever coming to the houses. But still we need a more empirical base here, and that's what we're just doing at the moment. And I would be very happy to disseminate the results we find there. It's a larger group here in Germany who's working on it, and we are part of it. Long
Great.
Answer.
Yeah, it's a tough one. This is probably a useful question because it kind of takes you back to the beginning here. And maybe I'll just move to this slide while you answer it. So the question was, why are you grouping individuals with symptoms why are you making this annoyance stress scale? There was a and to be clear, the questioner is asking why did you pool individuals together reporting being strongly annoyed with those with symptoms? But to be clear, you're not. You're just pooling those that reported being strongly annoyed and have symptoms, and then separately you're reporting which are those that are somewhat in the annoyance stress scale, those that are strongly annoyed that don't have symptoms. So you aren't pooling them necessarily together. You're just creating a distinction between those that are annoyed with symptoms and those that are strongly annoyed or somewhat moderately or very annoyed with no symptoms. But I guess it would be useful to just go back and talk about why this is so important, why create this new scale, annoyance stress scale.
Yeah, because as from a perspective of psychology, we define annoyance as experience negative impact, and that is stress. So we find different definitions of what annoyance is. Some definitions say you are annoyed when you start to shut your window because you don't want to hear the wind turbine. So, but that's a coping strategy we would say, and so people close their windows and they are fine; they are not disturbed anymore. But others would say, "Aha, this person is taking an action, so this person is annoyed." So that's one kind of definition that is applied in some environmental offices, for example. Others just use the annoyance scale that you might be familiar with, from not at all to very annoyed. And you end up with different numbers from the two different definitions I've given to you. And we are not satisfied with both of these definitions because as psychologists, we say that strongly annoyed persons are persons who really experience symptoms. So it's not enough to say, I am annoyed by it. What does it mean when you say, I am annoyed by the wind turbine in the landscape? Isn't that the same as saying, I just don't like it? I think it's ugly or whatever. So, and we say, yeah, of course you could say so, but this is not strong annoyance. Strong annoyance means you are having symptoms. And so this is what really counts. If people are experiencing symptoms, let's say we would find higher numbers. For example, Johannes has been working on shadow flickering in the late 90s, 2000. And the work he has done is really becoming the base of the shadow flickering regulations that you know nowadays. And they are really based on the research that Johannes has done. And what he found there was that a higher number, I think, he looks at me, I shouldn't give exact numbers because he said we didn't have exact numbers. What they found was a rather high percentage of people who experienced, for example, blood pressure, sleeping problems, taking sleeping pills, etc., due to the shadow flickering at that time. And then if we would have found higher numbers here in this US study, you would have to take action, because then you would say, okay, these people are really suffering, so you have to take action. And that's what happened with the shadow flickering regulations. The actions we're taking, and nowadays we have the shadow flicker regulations that we have. And what you can see here in this data, and also in the data we've over several cases here in Europe, that now shadow flickering is not a topic anymore. But the numbers of strongly annoyed people and having really severe symptoms was much higher before we had these regulations. So that's why we use this symptom-orientated approach to annoyance, because then you know whether you have to take actions or not.
That's great. Thanks very much for that explanation. Hey, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are now past the top of the hour. I didn't get a chance to jump in real quickly here. And just thank you all for attending. We do have a few more questions. I think we're going to try to get through some of them, probably go for another 10 minutes or so. But I just wanted to let folks know that they're perfectly fine to drop off if they've got other things that they should or would like to be doing. And we'll have this recording up on our webinar webpage. You can come and hear the last part of it if you need to go. But again, thanks everyone for attending today. And why don't we go back and answer a few more questions for those that can stick around. So let's see here. A question about, do we have any sense as to, so you made the comment about the regulations, that there are relatively low percentages, and that therefore it appears that the regulations are being improperly enforced, at least to some degree. I'm going to kind of join two questions, which is to say, we still have something greater than zero of people that are strongly annoyed that have symptoms. Aren't they important? That's sort of one questioner's question. And then the other question was, is there any evidence that there was a lack of enforcement, for example, for the regulations, or that they should be stronger? And maybe do you have any thoughts about that? Maybe even taking away from what you're doing there in Europe. So it's sort of a two-part question. Is it still, granted we have relatively small percentages, but aren't they important? And then the second question is about regulation. How do we get to the last mile here if we're trying to get there in terms of regulations?
Well, I think I didn't say that the regulations are used or applied improperly. No, I didn't say so. I think they are working quite well. You always have sometimes problems. You could always improve something, and I think that's always a challenge. For example, the dyno tails that you can use to make the turbines less noisy, but well, we don't know whether it's working or not. It has not been evaluated properly yet. But no, I would say the regulations are okay because we have so few numbers of people who are annoyed. And to understand this, we have here, I'm going back to Germany, in one of the case studies we did, and that's the only longitudinal study, by the way, due to annoyance by sound, wind turbine sound. What we see is that the numbers who in that village or in that area are that the number of persons who are strongly annoyed by the agriculture machinery is larger than the people who are annoyed by the wind turbines. And if you ask me if people are worth to be considered, even if it's only few, yes, I totally agree. But not only for wind turbines, but also for other emissions. For example, neighbors. Then neighbors can also be very annoying. So traffic noises here in Europe are quite a large problem. So that's the main problem. So that's what I wanted to say, that yes, you should try to improve whatever you can from the engineering part, and also to better understand what is annoying people. But we have a very small portion of people who are strongly annoyed that is experiencing symptoms, and yeah, it's a very small number. But of course, every person counts. But yeah, so I think we have, when you look to a different topic, let's say traffic or neighbors' noise or agriculture machinery, you will find also numbers of people who are strongly annoyed. So where shall we start?
I see. Okay. So there's a quick question I can answer here, which is, do we have any data on political affiliation of respondents? And we don't. Not a particularly good question to be asking during an election season, which we've had lots of people hang up very quickly. Plus, we're not. We do have demographics, and we have tried to correlate them to the degree that two are correlated. One could make a leap of faith, but that's not something we have data on. So there was a question here. Maybe I probably would be able to answer this, though maybe we could get more towards the German and European context here. So let's lay it out. The question was about the planning process. We have more information about what it means to have a planning process that is more fair, let's say. That was the subject of the second webinar that Jeremy led. He did a lot of the work digging into this question, and even there we aren't digging in as deeply as maybe we could have, given the fact that we're covering a lot of areas with this survey instrument. But the kinds of things that are correlated with having a planning process that is perceived as fair are having the individual or the community have a say in the outcome, having the ability to be able to influence the outcome. And the most strongly correlated aspect of planning process fairness was that the developer was perceived as being open and transparent. So again, that doesn't get us as far as we maybe would want to go. There is more literature in this area that maybe can provide more information about those subjects in particular. But Gundula, do you have some things to add there in terms of planning process fairness? Maybe what you've seen working in the European context, if one is to increase fairness and increase openness and transparency of developers?
Oh yeah, it's a topic here, and we have several approaches to do so, but in practice it's rather complicated, as I said before. When you are really working now on a very specific project, then we have problems with all the stakeholders, for example, the landowners who made contract with different enterprises, wind energy enterprises, then you can't have a real open process anymore. But a real open process for me would be, or not only for me, but also for landscape planners and other people working on it, that you could, for example, together with one community, find a solution where to really place the different turbines in a proper way that is, for example, connected to a certain history of this village. We have some examples from France or the Netherlands or Denmark where this has been done. And so that would be the best way to go. But this is not always possible. And it's much easier when you have a process on a much higher level where you're just talking about a regional planning process, but I'm not so familiar with your planning processes in the US. So I think this is a question that we should discuss in more depth and more connected to the possibilities and the regulations you do have in the US. But there's a lot of things going on here in Europe. Maybe one example, two last examples. One from Denmark. There we have the Office of Wind Energy, where the communities and the landowners get some consultancy, a neutral consultancy from a office, that is the wind office, and they are very well trained in all questions concerning wind energy. And we have a similar one here in Germany, in one of our Bundesländer, where they try to help the landowners and the communities to get good contracts and also get them all the information that they need, because the people on the local level sometimes feel like fighting David against Goliath. And so this is also one thing that helps. And there are more things to tell, but I think this would be a long night for us if we continue.
I have another question. I guess this is kind of coming into the last question here. This is really a comment, but I'm going to turn it into a question. The comment was just in terms of trying to get maybe a higher resolution data set of what is annoying about a particular sound. The questioner was curious whether people could use their smartphone and that could maybe record sound, maybe measure it during periods where they believe that it is most annoying to them. But so that was the comment. The question for you really is, would you mind just, when we just have a few more minutes here, trying to quickly tell about the research that you were involved in there that did just that had folks, they were given instruments to be able to record sounds at a particular time when they felt they were annoyed, and they thought this is a particularly annoying sound at this point, and tell us what instruments they used and what were some of the results. Again, just very quickly here, we have only a minute or two before we should close the webinar.
Thank you for that lovely question. So what we did was they got just simple recorders, and so we gave this to people living in a village where we had 10% of people who were strongly annoyed by wind turbine sound, that is 10% with symptoms. And we just gave the main opponents, we handled these recorders and said, please, to understand what's going on, we need you, because otherwise we can't do it. You have, please, to show us what's really annoying. And so only 2% used the chance, but these people were very reliable and very cooperative. And so they recorded, I think, more than 90 occasions with their little recorders, and then said, this is the sound that is annoying to us. And a colleague of us, he analyzed these sounds, and he's very experienced in that, and he found out that it is a amplitude modulation. So we made a sampling, so all the people from the village were coming together, and we played the recorded sound to them and asked them, is this the sound that is annoying you? And they said, yes. And then we explained that it is amplitude modulation, that it is a low frequency noise. It's not infrasound, otherwise you couldn't have recorded it with this simple recorders that we just handed to them. And very interestingly, people said, oh, now I know what it is. And then 1 year later, we found only 6% of people who were strongly annoyed by the wind turbines. And even the ones who were experienced more often this sound said, now I know it's not damaging me, I can live better with it. So that was a very interesting study, and it is published in the Energy Policy in January this year, 2018. And then maybe you can send the link around. You have the link.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe we can, I don't have it handy, but I can...
Johannes says it's on the list here on the last slide where you have the literature. So you can read on this research there.
There you go. I quickly went to that. So yes. It would be the 2018, this one, Understanding Stress Effects of Wind Turbine Noise, the Integrated Approach. Great. And this I believe, also ties in the work that was done in Canada, which most of the people on the call probably are familiar with, the Health Canada Sound Study. I know that you cited that there, and so it's, that's also another good place to look in terms of comparing individuals that are reporting annoyance with empirical data about symptoms and things like that. So with that, I think we'll have to close it. This was great. Thank you for everyone that stuck it out for the last bit here, and we will have this up on the web page for you to check out or send to your friends and others that weren't able to participate. But Gundula and Johannes, thank you so much for the presentation today. And with that, I think we'll end the meeting. Bye-bye, everyone.